Hello, David. Welcome to the program.
Hello, Sam. How are you?
I am well. Say hello to Emma Vigeland.
Hello, Emma. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you, Sam, for commanding him to say hello to me.
Well,
Yeah, right.
I
Right.
know.
Weird.
Yeah. Well, there
Okay,
you go.
Dad.
Yeah, exactly.
Jeez.
Well, first off, since I'm playing such a parental role, let me say that we are very proud of you, David, in part because last night Joe Biden rolled out. We had heard about it; it had been reported, but he rolled out to the American public the American Families Plan, and many of those ideas were not particularly new to me because I read the American Prospect, and you guys had written a family care series 6 months ago. And many of those ideas, which were not being talked about, he wasn't talking about a lot of these on the campaign trail, somehow found their way into his speech last night. So I just want you to know we're very proud of you. Keep up the good work. Keep your grades up.
And would you like a cookie?
But no, honestly, congratulations on that. That is,
Well,
it's
I mean, it wasn't just us. There was a whole community of people who've been involved in the care space and care infrastructure, seeing it as kind of the last vestige of the safety net that we needed to deal with, and seeing the system as it was now in terms of childcare, in terms of elder care, in terms of paid leave is completely unsustainable. So there was a lot of work that went into kind of moving the Democratic Party into the position that this needs to be a huge priority. And so I was gratified to see that. And you can read that entire issue. It was a special issue that we did at prospect.org/family-care.
all right. So with that said, let's go through some of the highlights that Biden laid out. And then I want to get your assessment of both the speech in terms of like and whether there's any value to just simply the rhetoric of the speech, and then into what's actually happening, your grades on Biden and your assessment of his ability to actually see those to fruition. So going through the family care, the American Families Act, which I think, just the idea, like, it's nice to see Democrats occasionally name something that is, sort of basic and, not sort of like convoluted on some level. The idea
It's
of
not even an acronym.
right. I mean, it's American, American Families Plan. That's not something that is like going to, you're like wondering what's going on. It's a plan to help American
Isn't that what I
families.
used to have with Sprint, like in the mid 90s, the family plan?
Yes. Well, there you go.
Yeah.
All right. So, all right. Let's start with education. Universal pre-K. We had that in New York. And for at least one of the years that my son went to preschool. And well, it's greater than UPK in New York City, because UPK in New York City is just 1 year. But I'll tell you, that made a big difference, and was implemented very quickly, and was just, I think, a huge success. They've expanded on that, and they're talking about universal across the country, as well as community college. Just walk us through that.
Yeah, there's 2 years of pre-K that are guaranteed in the bill, and 2 years of community college. I mean, the devil's in the details on all this stuff. I mean, we have put together a series called Building Back America, where we've looked at stuff in the jobs plan and in the families plan. And there's just not a lot of detail in these fact sheets. We have the broad outlines of what is going to be done. I mean, one thing that's a little bit concerning to me in this is that both the community college plan and universal pre-K is designed as, they're both designed as state-federal partnerships, which means the state has to contribute a share. And if they don't, then you have this inequality across the country where red states that don't want to provide this service suddenly, kids who have the accident of being born there won't have this advantage. So I think that's a problem. I think it's a problem that child care, which is for, I guess, younger people than this pre-K setup, or maybe different hours of the day or something like that, is something where individuals have to pay a share. They say that, we're going to cut it off at 7% of your income. You're not going to have to pay more than that if you're a low-income family. But universal pre-K is free. So like, if you're 2 years old, you got to pay a little bit. And if you're 3 years old, you don't. And there are all these different levels of programs, which is very confusing. There's a child care tax credit, but there's also this subsidy program. And then there's also another subsidy program. It's very convoluted. We're like building on existing programs because it's easier, but it makes the thing more kludgy. So I think it's not just childcare and it's not just pre-K. There are tons of unanswered questions on how these things will actually work in all of these plans. And it's the thing we don't talk about, which is implementation and design and structure. And I keep coming back to it because you can't have progressive governments unless government works. And we've seen this with other programs that have been very slow out of the gate, whether it's rental assistance or the music venues program, the Save Our Stages program, which in 4 months delivered no money. We have to figure out if these things make sense. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of time for Congress to get their arms around this, and they need to make the right choices.
Is the impulse to make, I guess they're not trying to make it convoluted, I guess, but to build on existing programs kind of born out of Democrats' fear of, I guess, broadening the social safety net in a more comprehensive way and cracking
credits. It seemed like the Biden administration was really determined to make the advanced child tax credit permanent, but apparently they just punted to the next president.
Yeah, it's a 5-year increase. It goes to 2025. Some of the other tax credits, like the increase in the earned income tax credits for childless adults and others, are permanent. But this increase in the child allowance, which is sort of the highlight of the American Rescue Plan, right? It's the thing that cuts child poverty in half. It's universal. That is only extended for 5 years, and it's kind of we dare you Republicans to roll this back, right? And so there's this almost like the Bush tax cuts where they just keep going and going and going. But things are unpredictable. We don't know that, and to make it permanent would just be another 5 years. But it seems like the cost of that has given pause in the White House. And if there's one thing that I think I want to impress upon you, it's that this whole idea that we were over deficit hawkery, that this was a thing of the past. We went through the rescue plan. We didn't pay for it. We rebutted the arguments about runaway inflation. We said these are investments and we have to do this. All of that is gone. All of that is gone. This plan, you heard Biden say last night, this plan is fiscally responsible, that every dollar of it is paid for. You heard a criticism of the Trump tax cuts not being paid for.
Yes.
This is the same rhetoric we've heard for 30, 40 years in the Democratic Party. And I think it's really, really dangerous in this moment because there is no consensus on how to pay for this. Yeah.
Okay.
And then, MMT. Yeah. You don't pay for anything. I know.
Well,
don't send me an email.
No,
but my point is that there's no consensus. So if you have to narrow your horizons on the tax side, does that mean you're going to have to narrow your horizons on the spending side because everything's got to be dollar for dollar? I hope not. I think there are reasons to do the tax plan that are wholly separate from funding the spending plan. I hope they're separate, but the rhetoric I heard last night, some of it at least, and what I've heard out of the White House more generally leaves me a little concerned.
Okay. All right. I want to get into that, but I want to sort of like, silo some of this stuff.
Sure.
And because I agree with you, like there's almost like two competing narratives in terms of the change or lack of change in the rhetoric that we saw from the Biden administration. And you've expressed like, I mean, the rhetoric matters, right? Like it starts to frame things. It can matter in a good way and it can matter in a bad way. And this is aside from what is going on actually in terms of policy, because as I was trying to express at the beginning of the show, this is the first tilling of the ground. This is before the seeds are planted. The ground is tilled. And, which part of the ground is going to be chewed up and softened up and ready for planting is important. And so let's first is there anything else in the American Families Plan that we should cover just in terms of like what was being put out there?
Well, I mean, Emma mentioned before that initially there was nothing on the healthcare side in this. So we were doing this American Families Plan to support families and not including the major preoccupation that families have, which is how am I going to pay for healthcare?
Right.
The administration relented after some pretty furious pushback and added making permanent what was in the American Rescue Plan, which was this extension of the Affordable Care Act subsidies for the exchanges, which makes sure that nobody pays more than 8.5% of their income in health insurance premiums. But of course, the exchanges, that's 15 million people. And
right.
There are, I learned from the census this week that there are 331 million people in the United States. And we're talking about 15 million. That's the beneficiaries from this healthcare piece. The fact sheet and Biden in his speech as well, weirdly goes on and on about lowering prescription drug prices and using the savings for that to improve Medicare, to maybe lower the age of Medicare to 60. But none of that is in the plan.
Right.
He kept talking about it, but none of it exists in the American Families Plan. He says that we'll do that later. And we have a great piece today by John Walker, who's a healthcare expert, about how Biden would rather build entirely new welfare systems for childcare and for paid leave and what have you, rather than try to touch one dime of the profits of the hospital and drug industries. Because if you mess with drug prices, if you lower the Medicare age, that's going to affect their profits. And this thing on the ACA really doesn't. In fact, it boosts profits of providers because you're giving more people health insurance. So it's almost like they want to sidestep that argument. They do not want to raise the ire of the healthcare industry, and as a result, we're not getting that change.
And just since we're here, let's be clear: the insurance companies, for the most part, would probably have not much of an issue with dropping the age of Medicare, let's say to 55 or 60. The real issue is going to come from the actual providers of healthcare, doctors and hospitals, because people between the ages of 55 and 65 are just more likely to be using medical services than people, let's say, between 45 and 55, broadly speaking. And Medicare controls costs, which means undercuts profits for these institutions. I mean, that's right. So people should understand this. This is not, I think like a lot of times there's a lot of focus on insurance companies when in fact the story, particularly in this cohort, is about medical providers, not the insurers. So
that's absolutely right. And it's a great point. When you shift these older non-Medicare patients into Medicare, if you look at it that you have a Medicare pool of patients and you have a non-Medicare pool of patients, both those pools become healthier when you do that shift, because you move more healthy patients into Medicare who are of lower ages. And this is a generalization, but it's broadly true. And you move sicker patients from the other pool into Medicare. Now, there's an interesting Rand Corporation study that says that on the exchanges, actually, if you take 55 and over out, that pool gets sicker, the exchange pool, because most younger people on the exchanges are less healthy, by and large. But that's a very small portion of how people get their health insurance. And the employer pools would get much healthier if you move 55 and up out. And if you allow people to go on Medicare earlier, you reduce job lock. People who are only working the end of their life because of the end of their work careers because of health insurance.
And then you're opening up the opportunities for younger people to go and get these jobs, essentially,
and move up the ladder.
Shifts up. Yep.
More important, move up the ladder. Yeah. So but so insurance companies probably be neutral to mildly positive about it, but the providers would hate it. And the providers are the problem in healthcare. And people love their doctor, but the doctor is the problem.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. So the rest of the speech, let's not get into like his sort of China and Russia saber rattling or sort of.
Well, I mean, Harold Meyerson had a good piece for us reacting to the speech, that he kind of put it in the context of what FDR was doing when he first came into office. Hitler rose to power right in the same month before FDR came into office. And there was a lot of talk at that time that, does democracy work? We were 4 years into a depression. Nobody could figure out a way out of it. There were these autocrats that were sprouting up around the world. And there was open talk of like, does America need a dictator? Like, do they need someone to just take charge? Because it doesn't seem to be working right now. I don't think we're in the same place as Hitler or anything, but there is a competition that Biden set up between democracy and autocracy. And he has made the case that democracy has not had very good years of late. And American democracy in particular has shown itself unable to meet a lot of these challenges. And so what he posited, much similar to FDR, is that we need to try this stuff to make the case that democracy can work again. And interestingly, I think the vaccine rollout was a test of that, and it was a test that was passed.
It's interesting too, because I think the more you look at the history of any type of progressive movement during, the post-war era, the notion of having to compete with the Soviet Union for civil rights, Medicare, there's a whole host of things that, to some degree, the existence of the Soviet Union forced or at least provided one factor in encouraging us to provide more for our people. And so
I think Biden's trying to recreate that again with respect to China. And, maybe you think that's successful and maybe you think that's needless saber rattling, but I think what's important is whether it works in Washington.
Right. I mean, that's the thing here, is that I think people need to understand that there is such a incredible disconnect between what happens in Washington, D.C. and what's happening outside of it. And that on some level, and it's weird to be in the positions that folks like us are in, which is on one hand, the primary consumers of what we talk about are just people who don't have any control over these things.
Right.
And then on the other hand, there's this other, and at varying degrees, I don't think there's anybody in the administration watching the show, with all due respect to me, but there is an attempt to influence what they understand is the reality through influencing the influencers who influence what the reality is. And that's bringing us into this deficit hawkery that is growing up. There is, like, and I know there are people who listen to the show are like, how can you say what Joe Biden is saying is relevant when it's not happening? Well, there is a relevance to the rhetoric. It can be good and bad. The deficit rhetoric that he was talking about is highly problematic because there's this sort of like feedback loop, and they start to believe that people actually care about it just because they've said it and somebody else said it. And then all of a sudden they're saying it. Now, part of them are using this deficit hawkery as a way of basically preventing this from happening. I mean, I'm seeing stories where you have progressives in Washington, lawmakers saying, we don't need to worry about raising taxes. Let's not worry about the tax part of this right now, because they don't want to get caught into this cycle of you need to pay for. Now, the reason why I think we should raise taxes is because we have massive wealth inequality and we need to deal with that, but not to pay for this stuff. But now you're like, you have a much more nuanced message about taxation than if you want to make sure that this spending bill goes through. So like, give us the outlines of that. And
I think it's really knotty. I think it's really, really muddled. The tax measures are popular, right? So just on that level alone, they're both popular and good policy because they attack capital income, which is exactly what you have to attack if you're going to get at this inequality piece. You're not going to be able to do it through income taxes. You need to look at the capital. That's where the money is. And they would limit things like private equity takeovers, because a lot of that is based on the tax preference that these companies get for doing these activities. There's a lot to like in the tax package, and there's this whole measure of doing it through enforcement, doing it through collecting the taxes that should have been collected in the first place without changing anything in the code. And that could get you hundreds of billions of dollars, although we don't know how much, and there's going to be a big fight over that. But the problem comes in the simple fact that while I think there's a consensus in the country to do these tax measures, there is not a consensus in the Democratic Party. There is not 50 votes for this tax program, not at all. And we've already seen Joe Manchin try to whittle away at the corporate tax rate, bringing it down from 28% to 25%. We've already seen a lot of people in the caucus worried about the capital gains tax thing, which only affects 0.3% of the population, people who make over $1 million. But they're all saying, oh, this might hurt investment and this might be a real problem. You had this crazy quote in the Wall Street Journal from John Tester, and I should probably just look it up because I want to get it right. But he said something like, well, I don't want to not pay for this, but I don't want to raise taxes, and I don't want to but if we do this infrastructure spending, we got to pay for it. And like that quote is exactly the blind canyon that we're walking down. And if you condition this spending on coming up with consensus on taxes, my fear is that you won't do any of it. And it's a real fear.
Let me read that quote. It is, my answer to that would be, hell, I don't want to raise any oh, sorry, wait a second. Hell, I don't want to raise, oh shoot, I've lost it now. It just,
it's okay.
I've lost it.
All right. I have a
oh, hell, I don't want to raise any taxes, but I don't want to put the stuff on the debt either. But if we're going to build infrastructure, we have to pay for it somehow. I mean, that is like, now here's the thing is that
a recipe for disaster.
Well, is that how, and I imagine this varies from person to person, but how much of that is like, a rigged sort of like equation? Like, look, I don't want to increase the deficit, but I also don't want to raise taxes, but we need to get this done. Like, it
is rigged, but
you have asked for
the question is which one of those statements are categorical and which one of them are rhetorical. And if they're categorical, then we got a real problem, like a no bill problem. I don't think people appreciate how close we are to having no bill because of this. If it's rhetorical, then something gets worked out maybe. And seemingly what would be most attractive is do it so that no taxes are actually raised, but we just collect more through enforcement. But the problem is that the Congressional Budget Office, which, if you're going to do this stuff, you need a scorekeeper. And unfortunately, they're the scorekeeper. They don't score investing in the IRS as yielding very much money. Last year, CBO did a report which said, if you invest $40 billion in the IRS, you'll get $100 billion back. Now, Biden's plan invests $80 billion and says it would get $700 billion back. So CBO is saying it's only less than a third as effective as what the Biden team is saying. And
let's be clear,
their numbers
there's
are going
data.
to be.
There's this. We don't have to, I don't know what CBO is using, but there's data from where every dollar that you put in, the return on investment is like $7 at least.
The IRS commissioner has said that we have $1 trillion annual tax gap. What CBO is saying is if you invest $40 billion in the IRS over the next 10 years, you'd only cover 1% of that tax gap. That's how much you would lower it if you do the numbers. That's going to be a huge problem because this is the thing that everyone maybe can agree on, and it only gets you a couple $100 billion.
Yeah, and the IRS buffing up, it's so temporary, and say another administration comes in, they can just shrink the size of the IRS. I mean, is that part of the calculation as well from some of these centrist Democrats? Because it's fluid. It's not written into tax code.
You can always roll back what you can give in. Absolutely. I mean, yeah, they don't want to piss anybody off, and they don't want to piss off any donor. And if you don't actually change the tax code, you don't piss off any donor. So yes, of course. The other thing here is that what are we talking about? We're talking about an infrastructure bill. We're talking about whether it's physical infrastructure, human infrastructure, or whatever. We're talking about things that are public investments that have return on those investments. Why do you have to, quote unquote, pay for that? There's a statement in one of the fact sheets that says every dollar that you invest in childcare yields, early childhood education, yields $7.30 on the other side in terms of increased wages and things like that. Well, then why do you have to pay for it?
Well, the funny thing is that like for years, we have been told, and I still lament that Democrats did not take advantage of what took place in the state of Kansas through much of the teens, I guess. We have been told that every time you cut taxes, you grow the economy and it will pay for itself. And that was fully accepted. Mm-hmm. But the fact that you invest in infrastructure, like you say, human or physical, quite obviously pays dividends because everybody does that in every other facet of every other endeavor. In some fashion or another, everybody does that, and it pays dividends in one fashion or another.
So I'm sorry.
No, but go ahead. I think like that's the point.
Yeah, you're right. And I was a lot less hopeful about this when I heard Biden's rhetoric last night. I've done some reporting. I'm continuing to do some reporting, and I'm a little bit more hopeful that these things are seen as separate initiatives within the White House, at least, that they rise and fall on their own merits. And
which initiatives?
The tax plan, the tax measures and the spending measures, and they're not coupled necessarily. But what the White House thinks and what Joe Manchin thinks might be two different things, right? And if he wants it paid for, then it's got to be paid for. So I think there's reason for concern, and especially it's like an old 90s argument, and you have the perspective you have because of the debates you grew up in. Yeah. And Joe Biden grew up in these debates, and Janet Yellen grew up in these debates. Her time in government was in large measure tied to these debates. Janet Yellen is part of like Pete Peterson's, or she was on the board of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. So she has this perspective, and I think that I don't think it's unanimous within the White House, but I do think there's an element of this that was apparent in the speech. And if that's the case, then I feel like you're just walking into a corner.
So the real question is how much of this rhetoric is to satiate the anxiety of the Janet Yellens and frankly, the Nancy Pelosi's. I mean, she also Pete Peterson acolyte. So let me ask you this. You mentioned people don't realize how close we are to having no bill. Okay. What is the opportunity cost for I mean, this gets to like, how much could and should progressives leverage different things in the House? What is the opportunity cost to a Joe Manchin if there is no bill?
Right. I mean, that's a huge question. I know what the opportunity cost is to the Democratic Party, and I think Joe Biden knows what the opportunity cost is to the Democratic Party, and that's going to inform his discussions with someone like Joe Manchin.
Absolutely. And with the Democratic Party and for progressives, both in terms of like the political fortunes of people and to the extent that there's any small cadre of people who actually like ideologically want this.
Yeah. And
it's cost, but
it's a hard thing. It's a hard thing because, yeah, exactly. I mean, that first of all, that's a whole problem in and of itself. And it's hard to see how we're going to get through that. Although, in the end, Joe Manchin sometimes does come around. You just got to make it worth his while, maybe. But in one sense, you don't want to go out right now. If you think that actually, yes, we need these tax provisions because inequality is soaring and we have this huge problem in the United States, you don't go out now and say, this doesn't have to be paid for because, or whatever. I don't want your emails. You don't go out right now and say that because then the tax stuff probably gets jettisoned like immediately, right? And they say, oh, it's free lunch. And if you think the tax stuff is important, you want to keep it in play. And it's also very popular. So it's a tricky situation, but I think what's important here is that you can't make the long run budget picture in 2045. You can't make these investments beholden to that. You can't make needed investments to protect the planet, to bring dignity to care work, to get Americans moving across the country with clean energy. You can't make that subordinate to how much interest we're going to be paying in 25 years on the national debt. I mean, you just can't do that. We need to get these things done. The Democrats were put in office to solve problems. They were not put in office to be fiscally responsible.
All right. So just so I'm clear on what your position is on it, and I happen to share this perspective too. You have two sets of problems. One is what material benefits are we going to provide for the American public? I think you and I and Emma would agree we would want more than is being offered here, but what's being offered here is significantly more than we've seen in a generation or two. Mm-hmm. And that's one part of the agenda. The other part of the agenda is we have this horrible wealth inequality, and it is fundamentally eroding our democracy in many ways. But in the most important way is it's preventing people from getting these material benefits. So you have a chance, it's like you're on a ladder and you're reaching for two different apples, as it were. And it's like, you can't reach for both apples. Which apple do you grab? You have one lunge.
Well,
and you're suggesting
I would say you can reach for both apples, but you can't make it so that you either get two apples or none.
Right. Okay.
At the end of the day,
fair enough. When you feel yourself falling off the ladder, you've got to lean one way or another. And so in your mind, the way to lean would be obviously to
The
to
way
get
to
that
lean
material
is on spending, because Democrats have a consensus on the spending,
right.
and they don't have a consensus on the taxes. I mean, that's the issue. So that's the only reason, by the way. I don't know that I would choose, I might choose differently if there was a consensus like, yes, we're going to tax the rich. Maybe it's a different consideration, but there isn't. And so you just can't, we can't have a situation where this dies. And I'm fearing we're walking down a road that makes that dangerously likely.
Well, David Dayen, that's a great note to end on. Very optimistic, and
Always a ray of sunshine.
there you go. But I think I can't tell you how much I appreciate your insight into these things, and the fact that these are informed not just by your meandering opinions, but from actually talking to the players involved here. David Dayen, executive editor of the American Prospect. Folks should head over there. There's a million different reasons to go over that site, and keep reading until you pass out, essentially. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
All right, Sam, thanks.